Off you get." The driver said it without turning around, which was its own kind of message. Phoebe Cairns had been watching the back of his neck for the better part of 3 hours, a thick, sun-reddened neck that had never once turned in her direction with anything resembling concern. And this was how it ended. 2 words and the creak of the wagon brake pulling firm against the October road. She had 2 trunks. Her ticket, the driver now informed her, as though this were perfectly obvious information he had only just remembered to share, covered one. "My ticket covers 1 passenger and personal luggage," she said. Her voice was level. She had worked for that levelness over 11 days of travel, and she did not intend to lose it now. 1 trunk. Hoyle pointed at the wagon bed where her 2 trunks sat side by side. The older one, black leather with a brass latch her father had given her, and the newer one, brown canvas, that she'd packed herself with fabric samples and 3 reference books on accounts management. Items she'd bought with her own savings for the position ahead. "Your paperwork says one. That big one's freight. Freight pays freight." "The woman who wrote my paperwork made an error," Phoebe said. "I was clear about the contents." "Her error isn't my problem." He lifted the brown trunk and set it in the road with less ceremony than a man setting down a bale of hay. The black one followed. Then he climbed back up without looking at her. The 2 other passengers inside, a married couple bound for a homestead another 20 miles east, had gone very still. Phoebe could feel their stillness through the canvas walls. She had spent 11 days in company with people who could not quite bring themselves to involve themselves in anything that required discomfort. And she had arrived at a place of understanding about this. People were not bad. They were simply economical with their courage. She stepped down. She did not make a scene of it. She walked to her trunks, repositioned them on the road with her hands, and she stood in the October dust and watched the wagon roll east until the sound of it was gone entirely. The silence was enormous. The Saskatchewan sky was the particular steel gray of a day deciding whether to rain, and the road stretched before her in both directions with the unhelpful evenness of something that has no opinion about your situation. To the west, where she had come from, nothing useful. To the east, where she needed to go, Pintail Creek, 14 miles, and a position she had not yet confirmed was still waiting for her. If this story of beginning again, of a woman who refused to become what a difficult road tried to make her, speaks to something you know in your own life, subscribe to Faded Love right now and tell us what city you're watching from. We want to know how far this reaches. Now, back to Phoebe. She sat on the black trunk, which was her mother's, and therefore the one she'd sooner sit on than the one she'd packed herself, and she did what she always did when the world gave her nothing useful to look at. She made an accounting. 2 trunks, both unharmed, $9.80 in an envelope in her coat pocket. She had counted it that morning while the wagon jolted through the hill country. Twice, then a 3rd time, because she found that numbers behaved correctly even when everything else did not. A letter of employment from Mrs. Beatrice Yardley, proprietor of Yardley's General Store, Pintail Creek, who had hired her 3 months ago by correspondence to manage accounts and inventory records. A winter coat, proper weight, properly lined, because October in Saskatchewan is not October in Montreal, and she had done her research. A pair of wool gloves, a tin of matches, a heel of bread from the last supply stop, a letter of reference from her former employer in Montreal, who had thought highly of her work and considerably less highly of her decision to leave. What she did not have, a horse, any knowledge of what 14 miles of Saskatchewan road looked like on foot, and any certainty that the position in Pintail Creek still existed. She had heard something at the Regina stop, a passing remark from a woman buying flour, something about Yardley's changing hands, and she had filed it under things to verify when I have facts, rather than things worth worrying about now. This was a system she had developed young, in a household that had given her many opportunities to practice it. She stood up, put the gloves on, and lifted both trunks. She started walking. She was perhaps 2 miles into it, the trunks trading between hands whenever one arm went past the point of useful, when she heard the wagon coming from behind her, from the west, from the direction she'd come. She stepped to the side of the road without quite stepping into the ditch. There was a difference between being visible and being an imposition, and she had always understood the difference. The wagon that came around the long curve in the road was a working wagon, solid, plainly kept, two horses pulling it with the easy rhythm of animals accustomed to this particular stretch of ground. The man on the seat was perhaps in his late 30s, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who has done physical work for years rather than for appearance, with a dark beard going gray at the edges and a canvas coat that had seen real weather. He slowed when he saw her. He stopped. "Are you all right?" he said. "Not, ma'am, not the performative courtesy of someone demonstrating their manners for an audience. Just the question, direct and plain." "Yes," Phoebe said. "Thank you." He looked at the trunks. He looked at the road ahead and behind her. He looked at the sky in the way of a man for whom weather is information rather than scenery. "The supply wagon put you off." It was not quite a question. She decided not to answer it precisely. "I'm traveling to Pintail Creek," she said. "That's 14 miles." He said it without inflection, the way a person states a measurement. "I'm aware." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, I'm going through Pintail Creek. You're welcome to ride, or I'll keep going if you'd rather." He said it without leaning on either option. The offer sat in the air between them, like a door held open. "Here it is, entirely your decision." Phoebe looked at the man on the wagon seat. She looked at the two horses. She looked at the sky, which had made its decision and was moving toward rain. She thought about 980s and a heel of bread and 14 miles and what she knew versus what she was afraid of. "Thank you," she said. "I'll accept." She lifted her trunks into the wagon bed herself. She saw him notice this, a slight pause before he settled back on the seat. But he said nothing about it. She climbed up to the bench beside him, and he clicked his tongue at the horses, and the wagon moved. For a while, neither of them said anything. The road unrolled ahead through stands of poplar gone yellow, and the wide, flat country that looked, in this light, like something that had decided to be exactly as much as it was, and nothing more. Phoebe used the silence productively. She noted the wagon was well maintained. The horses were a matched pair, calm and strong. There was a medicine kit tucked behind the seat, the kind with proper clasps rather than the improvised sort. 3 horse blankets in the wagon bed, folded with a precision that said something about the person who folded them. A name on a supply crate near her knee. A. Macrae, Pintail Creek. "Phoebe Cairns," she said. He glanced at her sidelong. "Alistair Macrae." "Horse rancher," she said. A brief pause. "That apparent?" "The horses are exceptional, and you're not nervous about the rain. People who aren't ranchers are nervous about rain." Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, but in the neighborhood of it. "I was delivering 2 mares to a homestead up by the Mission Hills. Going back empty." He paused. "Not entirely." "Not entirely," she agreed. The silence resumed. But it was a different quality of silence now. The kind between people who have acknowledged each other as real, rather than the silence of strangers managing proximity. Phoebe had lived enough of her life in rooms full of people who looked through her to know the difference, and she noticed it the way she noticed a correct sum at the bottom of a ledger. With quiet satisfaction. "What takes you to Pintail Creek?" he asked after a mile or so. "A position. Mrs. Beatrice Yardley hired me to manage her store accounts." Alistair Macrae was quiet for a moment with a particular quality to it. Thoughtful, not uncomfortable. "You know her," Phoebe said. "Everyone in Pintail Creek knows Beatrice Yardley." He paused. "She sold the store 2 months ago, maybe a bit more. New owner came from Regina." He said it steadily, without softening it, but also without the bluntness of someone who enjoys delivering bad news. He was simply telling her what was true, because she needed to know it. Phoebe received this. She turned it over. She looked at the road ahead, at the sky with its committed clouds, and she took a full breath of October air and considered the precise difference between a situation that was worse than expected and a situation that was beyond management. "Are you certain?" she asked. "Reasonably," he said. "I was told by 2 people who'd know." She nodded slowly. The letter of employment in her coat pocket had become, in the space of a sentence, a document of historical interest only. She could feel the weight of it recategorizing itself. "I'll need to see the situation when I arrive," she said. "Then I'll know what comes next." He looked at her then, just briefly, the kind of look someone gives when they're updating a first impression. "All right," he said. They were still 6 miles from Pintail Creek when the near horse went lame. A bay mare Alistair called Clementine, favoring her left foreleg in a way that started subtle and confirmed itself over a 1/4 mile. He pulled the wagon over with the careful attention of a man who handles animals the way other men handle facts, precisely, and without drama, and climbed down to examine her. Phoebe climbed down without being asked. He ran his hand down Clementine's foreleg, lifted the hoof, checked it in the failing light, set it down. He straightened. Bruised frog. She'll be fine with rest, but I won't push her 6 miles in the dark. All right, Phoebe said. What do we need? They made camp efficiently. She built the fire while he saw to the horses and unpacked the supplies he carried as a matter of course. He had a small camp kit, the kind carried by a man who treats preparedness as a personal standard. There was tea, hardtack biscuits, and dried meat. A canvas ground sheet he rolled out near the wagon for himself without discussion, and he helped position the wagon bed for her shelter with the same plain practicality he brought to everything. The fire was good. The tea was better than anything she'd had since Regina. You were a bookkeeper in Montreal, he said. He had the quality of a man who asks questions because he wants the information, not because he's filling silence. For a textile firm. 4 years. She looked at the fire. Before that, my uncle's import business. She paused. She had not intended to say the next part. She said it anyway, because something about the fire and the enormous quiet of this country made performing carefulness seem like a waste of effort. My uncle arranged my marriage to a man named Arthur Beaumont. It was a business arrangement. My uncle had debts, and the Beaumont family needed a connection in the import trade. I was the useful element. Alistair said nothing. He was the kind of man who understood that silence was a form of attention, and that attention was sometimes the most valuable thing you could offer. Phoebe said, I found Mrs. Yardley's advertisement in a Montreal paper, and I bought a train ticket to Regina and a wagon passage west, and I didn't tell anyone until I was already gone. I took my wages from the last month's work, which I was owed, and my trunks, which were mine. She looked up. I signed nothing. I agreed to nothing. I was informed of the arrangement the way you inform someone about a change in weather. They'll look for you, Alistair said. Perhaps. She had thought about this on every leg of the journey. Whether they consider the return worth the expenditure is something I'll find out. She looked at her tea. I'd rather find out from somewhere I've already built something real. The fire settled. The horses were quiet behind them. The stars out here were the kind Montreal had never shown her, not through light pollution or city noise, but simply because the sky here was a different proposition entirely. It was, she decided, the correct sky for a place that expected you to be honest about what you were. Your ranch, she said after a while. You built it yourself. Started it 8 years ago. Came out from Prince Edward Island with enough money to buy the land and not much more. He looked at the fire. My wife came 2 years later. She died in the 3rd winter. A child that didn't come right. He said it the way a person says something that has been said enough times that the words have gone smooth, even if the thing behind them remains exactly its size. 7 years ago. Phoebe did not say she was sorry in the reflexive way people do to fill a silence they find uncomfortable. She said, 7 years is a long time to run a ranch alone. It keeps you from thinking too much. Is that enough? He looked at her then, not startled, but with the expression of someone encountering a question they hadn't arranged themselves for. He seemed to consider it genuinely. Some days, he said. Other days, no. She nodded. She knew the distinction. She had spent 4 years in a Montreal office where she was efficient and invisible, and she had known both kinds of days very well. She slept in the wagon bed under 2 horse blankets and woke to Alistair already rebuilding the fire, the sky a cold, clear gray that meant it had decided against rain after all. By the time the light was full, they were moving again, Clementine walking sound at a careful pace, and Pintail Creek appeared an hour later the way small towns appear in flat country. Not gradually, but all at once, a collection of wooden buildings set down in the land, as though placed by a practical hand. A woman in a dark coat came out of the post office before Alistair had the wagon fully stopped. She was perhaps 50, with quick eyes and the posture of someone accustomed to being the first to know things. You're the woman Alistair brought in, she said to Phoebe, without preamble. I arrived with Mr. Macrae, yes. Phoebe climbed down from the wagon seat. My name is Phoebe Cairns. I came for a position with Mrs. Yardley. The woman. Dorothy Yates, she said, who ran the post office and by the sound of it approximately everything else of significance. Went through several expressions in quick succession. Not pity, not satisfaction, Something more like the recognition one capable woman extends to another when she sees what's actually in front of her. "Beatrice is gone," she said. "Sold the store to a man from Regina who brought his own staff. I'm sorry, Miss Cairns. You've come a long way for nothing." "I've come a long way," Phoebe said. "Whether it amounts to nothing remains to be seen." She looked at Dorothy Yates steadily. "Is there work in this town for a bookkeeper, or anything related?" Dorothy looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Come inside, I'll put the kettle on." Phoebe Cairns stayed. She took a room at Isabel Price boarding house, clean, with a wood stove that worked, and a landlady with strong opinions about mealtimes and strong opinions about everything else. She began within the first week to keep Alistair Macrae's supply records, which had accumulated over 8 months, into a condition less a filing system and more an archaeological site. She worked through them with the focused calm of someone who finds disorder solvable, because it always was, if you were patient enough to find the logic underneath it. She also began helping Dorothy Yates, who was drowning in post office administration, land registry forms, supply manifests, correspondence for settlers who couldn't write well or at all. Dorothy paid her what she could and introduced her to everyone who came through, which was everyone in Pintail Creek eventually, and that was worth considerably more than the wage. 3 weeks in, she found the discrepancy in Alistair's feed orders. A supplier in a town called Branton, 40 miles east, had been billing him for premium-grade oats at a rate that exceeded what premium-grade oats cost anywhere in the territory. Not dramatically, 3 or 4 cents per bushel, but the orders went back 2 years, and when she added the difference, it came to $168. She presented this to Alistair on a Tuesday morning with the invoices organized chronologically and a clean summary sheet showing the full calculation. She had prepared for various responses. What she received was him picking up the summary page, reading it carefully, setting it down, and looking at her. "You're certain," he said. "I have every invoice. The overcharge is consistent across all of them, which means it's not an error." She turned the top invoice toward him and pointed to the column. "Errors are inconsistent. Consistent patterns have deliberate causes." He looked at the page again. Something moved across his face, not anger, but the particular expression of a capable man confronting evidence that he's been less capable in one specific area than he understood. "I'll need to send a letter to Branton." "I've already drafted one," she said. She produced it from the folder. "If you'd like to look it over." He read it in the careful way he did most things. Then he looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. Not quite surprise, but in the vicinity of it. "You drafted this before you knew whether I'd want to pursue it." "I know how much $168 is," she said. "I assumed you'd want to pursue it." Something in his expression shifted, the not-quite smile she had already learned to read. "Send it," he said. The money came back in 6 weeks. The Branton supplier sent a draft without a cover letter, which told Phoebe everything she needed to know about whether he knew what he'd done. It was Dorothy Yates who first noticed Claude Renwick. He came in on the Regina stage on a Thursday 3 weeks after the Branton settlement, wearing a coat that cost more than most people in Pintail Creek earned in a month. Dorothy described him to Phoebe the following morning with the precision of a woman who had looked at him with the specific intention of being able to describe him accurately later. Early 50s, Montreal cut to his clothes, the bearing of a man accustomed to outcomes going his way. He had been asking about Phoebe, whether she was in Pintail Creek, where she was working, whether she'd been there long. Dorothy had told him she didn't keep track of every person who passed through, which was a lie of such magnificent proportions that Phoebe almost smiled. "He's not a detective," Phoebe said. She had known with the particular cold clarity of someone who has already done the calculation once that something like this would come eventually. "He's a representative. The Beaumont family sent him to pressure me into returning." "Can he compel you?" "No, I've broken no laws. I left before anything was signed." She looked at her tea. "He can make claims, though. He can tell people things about me that frame my leaving as something disreputable, and in a town that's known me 2 months, against a man who comes with Montreal correspondence." She stopped. Dorothy Yates put both hands flat on the counter. "Tell Alistair." "Yes," Phoebe said. "I will." She rode out to the Macrae ranch that afternoon, on a horse borrowed from the livery. Alistair was at the fence line near the barn and came toward her with the unhurried attention of a man who sees something unexpected and moves toward it rather than away. She told him plainly. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "They sent someone." "Yes." "Because you left." "Because leaving cost them something my uncle had promised them." She looked past him at the flat reach of his land, the autumn grass going pale. "My uncle's arrangement with the Beaumont family depended on me. Without me, it falls apart." He was quiet for a moment. "What does he want, this man?" "To pressure me into going back voluntarily. He'll try to damage how I'm seen here if I refuse." She held his gaze. "He'll come to the ranch. You're my employer of record. He'll assume that gives him leverage." "Let him come," Alistair said. He said it simply, without emphasis, just as a fact about what would happen and how he intended to handle it. Claude Renwick came to the Macrae ranch on a Monday. Phoebe was in the records room when she heard the unfamiliar horse, and she was at the door before he reached it, a decision made deliberately. She had learned, over the course of her life, that facing toward things was always preferable to facing sideways. He was exactly as Dorothy had described. He looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. He had expected, perhaps, to find her chastened. He found her standing in a doorway with her hands at her sides and her chin level. "Miss Cairns," he said, with the reasonable voice of a man who had rehearsed it. "Come in, then," she said. They sat across the kitchen table from each other. He explained the Beaumont family's position. He used words like obligation and understanding and fair arrangement, and she listened to all of it with the attention she gave to numbers, carefully, so she could identify exactly where the reasoning failed. "I signed nothing," she said when he'd finished. "I agreed to nothing. I was informed of the arrangement, which is not the same thing as consenting to it. I am a person, Mr. Renwick, not a line item in a contract." She kept her voice level. "If you have a legal instrument that compels my return, I would like to see it." He shifted. He reached for a different approach, implications, suggestions, the kind of language designed to make you feel the ground moving under you without being able to point at what moved it. He mentioned reputation. He mentioned the questions reasonable people might ask about a woman who had fled her responsibilities. The door opened. Alistair came in the way he came into most rooms, quietly, without announcement, closing the door behind him with exactly the force required. He looked at Renwick the way he looked at most things, steadily, without hurry. He didn't sit. He stood at the edge of the table, and he said what he had to say without heat and without performance. That Frederick Morse, the territorial magistrate, had been a friend of his for 9 years, and did not think well of men who came into his territory making implications designed to intimidate residents. That Pintail Creek was a town that paid attention to its own. That Phoebe Cairns had been honest with every person in it since the day she arrived, had done good work, and had standing here that a stranger with Montreal correspondence was not going to dissolve over one Monday morning. And that if the Beaumont family had a legal claim, they could pursue it through legal means, and that otherwise Mr. Renwick would find the next Regina stage leaving Thursday. Renwick looked around the room at two people who were not going to give him what he'd come for. He stood. He adjusted his coat. He looked at Phoebe with the flat expression of a man filing something away, and she met it without flinching, because she had learned a long time ago that people who expect you to flinch derive all their power from the flinch itself. "This won't end here," he said. "For your sake," Phoebe said, "I hope it does." He left. The sound of his horse moving out of the yard was one of the finer sounds she had heard in recent memory. Alistair sat down across from her at the table. "You all right?" "Yes," she meant it entirely. "That's the conversation I've been preparing for since Montreal." She looked at her hands flat on the table. "It helps having someone at the door." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Fee," he said. "I know," she said before he could continue. "You don't," he said. "What I was going to say is that this house has been quiet for 7 years." He said it plainly, the way he said everything. Not as a declaration requiring a particular response, not as pressure, just as a fact he had decided it was honest to say aloud. "It's not quiet the same way anymore. I thought you should know that." The kitchen was still. Outside, the horses moved in the yard. The October light was long and thin through the window. "That's not a question," she said. "No," he said. "It's not. I'm not asking you anything. I'm telling you what's true." She looked at him across the table. She thought about the accounting she had made on that empty road. What she actually had, right now, in this exact moment. The list was considerably longer than it had been that October afternoon, and the longest entry on it, the one she hadn't known to include, because she hadn't known to expect it, was sitting across from her with the patient, undemanding attention of a man who had learned that some things only arrive when you stop requiring them to hurry. "All right," she said. "All right." Renwick left Pintail Creek on the Thursday stage, which Dorothy Yates confirmed before 8 in the morning, with the serene efficiency of a woman who considers timely information a civic responsibility. But the particular quality of his leaving, deliberate, unfinished, stayed in the air of the town for weeks. The letter from the Beaumont family arrived 3 weeks later, addressed not to Phoebe but to Frederick Morse, the territorial magistrate, making claims about a woman of uncertain character who had fled legitimate obligations and deceived the honest citizens of the region. It was the kind of letter that knew exactly what it could and could not say outright, and managed to say everything else. Morse called a meeting. The church was the only building in Pintail Creek large enough, and by 7 o'clock it was full. Phoebe sat in the second row with Dorothy on one side and Isabel Price on the other. Alistair sat directly behind her, and she could feel the steadiness of him back there, the way you feel warmth from a stove without seeing it, without turning around, entirely real. Frederick Morse read the letter aloud in full. Accusations made in private are shadows. In public, in full, they acquire a shape that can be examined and that can be recognized for exactly what they are. When he finished, Phoebe stood up. She had not written anything down. She had found, over the course of her life, that the truth required no preparation, only the willingness to say it plainly, which was a different kind of work. She told them about the arrangement, about the meeting she hadn't been invited to, only informed of, about the letter from Mrs. Yardley that had given her a different road west, about what she had taken when she left, her own wages, her own trunks, and what she had not, about Claude Renwick and what he'd come for and what he'd found instead. She stood in that church and told the truth about herself in a clear voice that did not shake, because she had earned that voice over 11 days of travel and 2 months of building something real in a town she had chosen to stay in, and she was not going to waste it now. Dorothy Yates stood when Phoebe sat down. "She kept better books for this post office in 6 weeks than I managed in 6 months, she said, with the succinct delivery of a woman who considers flourish inefficient. And she recovered $168 from a Branton feed supplier who'd been overcharging the Macrae Ranch for 2 years. I don't know what else you need." Isabel Price stood. "She's paid her rent on time and she shoveled the walk twice without being asked," she said. "That's more than I can say for most." Frederick Morse looked at the room. "I have no legal concern regarding Miss Cairns's conduct in this territory," he said. "This letter is an attempt to use community opinion as leverage in a private dispute. That is not something I look on kindly." He set it down. "Unless someone has something to add that changes that assessment, we're done." No one did. The reply from her uncle came 6 weeks later, forwarded through her brother in Montreal, who had apparently decided somewhere in the preceding weeks that doing nothing was its own kind of choice, and that he was finished making it. Her uncle had written 3 pages. The man who had raised her after her parents died, who had taught her double-entry bookkeeping at 11 years old and called her sharp as a tack and meant it as the highest possible compliment, who had also looked at his debts and looked at his niece and done an arithmetic that put her on the wrong side of the ledger. "I knew what I was doing when I did it," he wrote, "and that makes it worse than if I hadn't known. I told myself a great many things that were not true. The Beaumont family has dropped the matter. I want you to know that I have told Arthur Beaumont directly that any further action toward you will mean I withdraw what cooperation remains between our families, which is the only card I have left to play, and I am playing it on your side, late as that is." And at the very end, in handwriting that had gone very small, "Your brother tells me you have made yourself indispensable to a post office and a horse ranch and an entire small town, which surprises me not at all. I am sorry I did not build you a better road. I am glad you built one yourself." Phoebe read it at her work table in the corner of Dorothy's post office that she had, over the preceding weeks, come to think of as her own. She read it twice. She sat with it for a long time, not managing her reaction, not keeping it at the level she kept everything when it threatened to be too much, just letting it be the size it actually was, which was considerable. When she was done, she folded it and added it to the envelope with the others she kept, each one a document of something true, and she went to find Alistair. He was at the livery, which was where he was on Monday evenings when he stayed in town. He turned when she came in with the quality he always had of knowing when she was nearby, which she had stopped trying to explain and simply accepted as one of the facts of him. She told him. He listened. When she finished, he said, "How does it feel?" Not what does it mean, not what happens now, how does it feel? Like I've been standing against something for a very long time, she said, and it just stopped pushing. She looked at him. It doesn't fix what he did, but it shifts something. Yes, Alistair said, I imagine it does. They stood in the dim livery with the horses quiet around them, and the October wind finding the gaps in the walls. He crossed the space between them, and he took her face in both hands with the particular careful attention of a man who understands exactly what he's holding, and he looked at her for a moment that was not long but felt complete. And then he kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that exists not for an audience, but because two people have arrived, finally, at the place they have been moving toward through all the weeks of honest work and careful words between them, and they recognize it, and they meet it without making a performance of it. When they stepped back, the distance between them was different from any distance that had existed there before. Well, Phoebe said. Well, Alistair said. She almost smiled. He was already doing the not-quite smile she had come to think of as one of the more reliable things in her life. He asked her to marry him in March, at the kitchen table, over the ranch accounts, which felt entirely right. He said, I've been trying to find the correct way to say this for longer than I should have spent on it. He set down his coffee. I know what you've built here is yours. I know the difference between a woman who marries because she needs a roof and a woman who chooses because she wants to. I've watched you be the second kind since the day I stopped on that road. He held her gaze with the steady directness that was his particular form of courage, not loud, not announced, just present and completely unwavering. I want to spend the rest of my life across this table from you. This house has not been quiet the same way since you came into it, and I don't want it quiet anymore. Phoebe looked at him. She looked at the account, ledgers spread between them, the one she had organized from 8 months of accumulated disorder into a system that ran cleanly and told the truth about itself. You know it was Clementine's fault, she said. He blinked. I beg your pardon? Your horse. If she hadn't bruised her hoof, you'd have dropped me in Pintail Creek, and we'd have been cordial and nothing more for years. She looked at her hands. I've always thought Clementine deserved some acknowledgement. Alistair stared at her for a moment. Then he laughed, the real kind, the unguarded kind, the kind she had heard from him only a handful of times, and that still had the quality of something remarkable. Yes, he said when he'd gotten himself together, Clementine absolutely deserves the credit. She looked at him. He looked at her. Yes, she said, on the condition that the post office work is mine to keep. I've never suggested otherwise. I know, I'm establishing it formally. Phoebe, he said. Yes, she said again, because that was the whole of it. Yes, entirely meant, nothing held back, offered from a position she had built herself on a road where she'd been left with 2 trunks and 980 mens, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who understands that being left behind is not the same thing as being finished. She had never been finished. They married in April, in the church where she had stood and told the truth about herself, to a room full of people who had then decided who she was and gotten it exactly right. Reverend Halloway performed the ceremony with the mild, genuine warmth of a man who believed in the occasion, and the whole town came. Not as a social obligation, but because they had watched something real take shape in their town over 7 months, and they wanted to be present for its completion. Dorothy Yates cried in the efficient, unapologetic way she did everything. Isabel Price brought a pie considerably better than any occasion required. Frederick Morse shook Phoebe's hand afterward with the dry directness of a man who gives compliments infrequently and means them completely when he does. Phoebe Cairns Macrae kept the post office accounts and the ranch accounts and her own work table in the corner of Dorothy's building where the morning light came in at exactly the right angle for close work. she kept them with the same precision she had brought to everything, because numbers behaved correctly even when everything else did not, and because there was a particular satisfaction in a ledger that balanced, in a sum that came out true, in a life that added up to exactly what you had built it to be. On a Tuesday morning in May, she rode out to the Macrae ranch on a gray mare she had come to think of as her own, along the road where 7 months earlier she had walked alone with 2 trunks and made a careful accounting of what she actually had. The road was familiar now. The country was familiar. The man who would be at the fence line when she arrived was familiar, and none of it had stopped being remarkable simply because it had become ordinary. That, she had learned, was the particular quality of a life built on honest ground. It held. It held in the good weather and the hard winters, and in all the plain ordinary days in between. And it held because it had been built by someone who had stood in the dust of a prairie road on an October afternoon, looked at what she had, and decided that what she had was enough to start with.